Thank you very much for allowing me to be part of this amazing event here in Dharamsala, MacLeod Ganj. So I'm very pleased to be here, and I'll be the first one to switch into a slightly different way of thinking about the mind, but which is more experimental. So in the tradition, you could say, that I'm a part of, within cognitive science, we actually don't take asking people questions very seriously, and instead what we try to do is coming up with experiments, and we measure people's response times and accuracies and try to infer from that what's going on in their mind. So it's a bit like continuing on the line of work that Catherine Shepard introduced. So today I'll be talking about how we could find some evidence for effects of meditation on the mind by using computational models. And the reason I really like computational models is they are very much an exercise in clear thinking. So hopefully over the course of this talk, what I mean with that will become a bit more clear. So meditation has been associated with many benefits demonstrated in all kinds of different studies. So people have used these self-report measures that we've talked about this morning. So one of the clearest findings is that mindfulness meditation seems to reduce people's depression. There have also been effects shown on really biological measures. So there's been evidence for an improvement in the immunity system, also differences in a part of your DNA that's called telomerase, which has been associated with becoming older. Actually, the shrinkage of that has been reduced in people who went on a 3-month-long intensive shamatha meditation retreat. And in different lines of research, which are more the kind of things that I'm focusing on, people have seen changes in attentional functioning of meditators. So today I'll be talking about a study that's here referred to, or that's actually not referred to. Today I'll be talking about one of these studies that looks a bit at attention and memory. I've also later done some studies, for example, the one I refer to here, van Vugt and Slachter, which I recently completed. We looked at how people's attention changes when they practice different types of meditation. So you can even use experiments to disentangle that. And it turns out, for example, that in one type of meditation where they really focus intensely on the stimulus, then people have a tendency to get stuck on perceiving stimuli on the screen, and therefore they sometimes miss other things that come rapidly thereafter. Whereas if they're practicing a type of meditation in which they are just generally aware of whatever arises in their experience, they can really see stimuli that are represented at a very rapid pace. And previously, people had shown improvements in the ability to see that rapidly, but it was not known whether that was generic to any type of meditation or whether it depends on the type of meditation that people practice. Anyway, those are just some background findings, but all of these previous studies have really focused on general task performance. So what they do there basically is, you sit people in front of a computer and you ask them to to respond to images and words that you present on the screen. You measure how quickly they do it, how correctly they do that, and then you try to infer things from that. But of course, in these responses, in the rapidity and in the accuracy, we don't really know what's exactly going on. Kind of akin to the question that came up this morning, if we observe a slower response to negative stimuli, then what is really happening there? And so in the case of attention tasks, there could be different reasons why people get faster or why they get better? Is it that their attention is sort of stronger so that they are able to perceive things more clearly? Or is it that they get more accurate because they're just more cautious in making a response? Or is it they get faster because they are just more quickly able to press a button? All of these things can be a cause for a change in how fast people respond and how accurate they are. So to disentangle all of those possibilities, what I do is I make use of models of cognition. And what I mean by that is I can write pieces of computer code, or I can write down equations that you can simulate on a computer, that when you give them the same task as the human, they should produce roughly the same results. And then by turning on different knobs of those computer simulations, I can see sort of what kind of mechanisms in my model do I have to change when people start meditating, for example, to reproduce their behavior. So here in the picture, you can see we've demonstrated the idea. On the left, you can see sort of a cartoon of a real brain, and a real brain would be doing tasks like learning French words, cycling, all kinds of things. And on the right, you can see a computer simulation that would also be like a brain, and that would also be maybe learning French words or Tibetan words for that matter, or biking or walking around. And what we try to do is match those two up as closely as possible. And then when circumstances change, we can see what in these computer models we have to change to produce the corresponding change in behavior. So that's the approach that I'm going to demonstrate in my talk. So in the first experiment that I will be talking about, we investigated how clearly people can remember things. And we wanted to see whether meditation, in that case it was shamatha meditation. People were practicing what's called the 4 foundations of mindfulness. And they did that for a month long. We tested them before and after that month, and we wanted to see whether the things they could remember were had a much clearer quality. So here you can see somebody trying to remember a face. Those are the kinds of faces that we gave people to remember. So you can see they're quite abstract, and you actually really have to memorize the details of the face to be able to distinguish different versions of that face that we gave them. So this is the task they got. They first saw a sequence of about 3 faces presented one after the other, and here you can see how they kind of look like one another, so it's hard to distinguish them. Then they waited for a few seconds, and then we presented them with yet another face. And we looked at their decision about whether that last face was one of the faces we asked them to remember. So then, once they knew their answer, they responded, and we could look at their responses. So we gave this task to 29 experienced meditators at Shambhala Mountain Center in Colorado in the United States, and compared to the 29 controls who just went about their normal life. They had about the same age and education and gender balance. So yeah, and here you can see the stupa of Shambhala Mountain Center. It was quite a fun study to do, to get to go there a couple of times. So yeah, they did this task, and then our models come in. So the way we think that people do this kind of a task is that when they see that probe image, the last image, and they have to formulate the response, is they start to accumulate evidence over time. So here, each one of those lines represents this evidence accumulation process. It's wiggly because it's noisy, and we think that people make their response as soon as they reach a decision threshold. So those are the horizontal lines that you see there. So people's response time is then determined by the time it takes people to reach that decision threshold, to which we add some constant time that represents the time you need to simply perceive a stimulus, which takes maybe just over 100 milliseconds, plus some motor delays, because you always need a little bit of time to implement a motor response once you've made your decision. So there the model can predict the response time. And the model also predicts what response you're going to give, because if it reaches, say, the upper threshold, then you're going to say, in this case, yes. And if you reach the lower threshold, then you're going to say no. Now, what's nice about this model is that if we feed this model with a whole range of responses that people have given us, plus the response times, then it can actually give us an estimate for what people's non-decision time is, but also at what height they put their decision threshold. And that's interesting because it tells us how cautious people are. If they put their decision threshold very far from the beginning, from the starting point, that means they collect a lot of evidence before they decide to give their response. So they're very cautious. And of course, conversely, if they're very close to the starting point, then even a random fluctuation can bring them over the threshold, and they probably make lots of errors. In addition to that, the model gives us an estimate of how clear the evidence is, because you can imagine that if you have very clear information, that you can just race towards the threshold and make your response and you're done. Whereas if the evidence is much more ambiguous, if you're like, is this it? Is it something else? Then it takes much longer to actually reach that decision threshold. So it's the more shallow line. So our model gives us estimates of that, and we can look at how they are affected by the meditation practice. So here are the results. On the left, we look at the decision threshold. So how far from the beginning do people place their threshold for responding, which tells us how conservative they are. And basically, we found that on the left, you can see the meditators, the meditation training. On the right, you see the controls. On the light gray, you see the controls. And the meditators had a much of a decrease in the decision threshold the second time we tested them, whereas the controls did not change. So that means they needed less evidence to respond than the controls. What we also observed, probably much more interestingly, is that the meditators, you can see that in the right graph, they increased their drift rate, which means that the evidence on which they based their judgment was clearer. Now, how is that possible? We gave them the same faces, right? Well, that is, we think, because they practiced meditation and they had less noise in their mind, as it were, and therefore the evidence that they actually were able to extract out of the faces that we presented them was much clearer. And actually the controls did not change, or if anything, they actually got worse. So here we show that after a month-long shamatha retreat, there seems to be evidence for an increase in mental clarity that we could really find out by really focusing very deeply on the exact mechanisms that might be involved in performing this task. Another example of his very precise mental measurements are of a group of people that were suffering from depression, and we looked at how they are remembering emotional information and to what extent they were actually getting stuck in this emotional information, because our models of this what's called a free recall process, which is, you learn a list of words and you ask people, now, reproduce the list of words in any order that you like. And our models of that process had suggested that it makes sense to actually look at what kind of transitions do people make when they remember a list of words. Do they keep repeating positive words, or do they switch from positive to negative to neutral words, or how exactly do they do that? So we looked at that in this group of people who are suffering from depression. So just in a little bit more detail, the task that we asked them to do is, they received a list of about 20 words in the study phase. So it could be like cat, eagle, ring, pen, book. And for every word, they were asked to say how pleasant they thought the word was and how aroused they were by feeling that word, how arousing it felt. And then they had an intermission of 15 minutes, and then we asked them, okay, now, reproduce the list of words in whatever order you like. And we then, crucially, focused on, were they clustering, getting stuck in remembering negative words, as you would expect from people who are depressed, or were they able to switch between negative and neutral and positive words? So the people who did this were 52 depressed patients, and 29 of those were randomly assigned to mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, and 29 just received their normal treatment. So in mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, they do mindfulness practices. They also practice decentering, like we talked about this morning. And importantly, they cultivate this attitude of being willing to remain present with unpleasant stimuli or sensations. And so we looked at to what extent do these people when they recall lists of words, do they get stuck in remembering negative words, or are they able to stay with positive words? So here on the left, we look at their tendency to stay with positive words. And in green, you can see them before the training, and in yellow is after the training. In the left column, you see the mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, and in the right column, there's the controls. You can see that people after mindfulness-based cognitive therapy are much better able to keep recalling positive words once they were doing that. And conversely, in the right graph, you can see that actually they're much less have a tendency to get stuck in recalling negative words. And controls actually show pretty much the opposite pattern. So they're much more stuck in remembering negative words. They can't get out of that. So that's one effect of this mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. And another thing we looked at is, after these 15 minutes, how do they start recalling words, which gives an indication of what kind of mood they're in. Because if you're in a more positive mood, you will be much more likely to remember positive words than when you're in a negative mood. And if you look at the graphs here, you can see that actually at the first time, so in the green graphs, there's not much of a difference between the mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, MBCT, and the controls. However, at the second time, you can see there's a marked reduction in the tendency to start with a positive word for the controls relative to mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, and actually a corresponding increase in starting with negative words. Now, why would there be such an increase in negativity? Well, that's because we gave them the very nasty task that Emiliana talked about yesterday, where you have to give a speech in front of a very critical, very stern-looking audience. So people didn't like that at all, and they were probably a little bit traumatized by it. But actually, as it turned out, the mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, we think, may have had some protective effect, so that they were still able to, even with that experience, remember positive words and not get stuck in the negative words. So these are just a few examples of how we can use our cognitive experiments and our models of the mind, our very precise models of the mind, to just dissect, really, how mindfulness and shamatha meditation might affect our minds. So in experiment 1, I showed you that shamatha meditation leads to a reduction in mental noise. In experiment 2, I showed you how mindfulness-based cognitive therapy seems to lead to a reduction in getting stuck in negative information. And although I don't have time to talk about it right now, we had a lot of fun actually in the workshop discussing about how we could model the process of meditation itself. how could we get a computer to meditate? Of course, I don't really believe that a computer can meditate, but it's a useful thinking tool to think very precisely, you know, what processes are involved in meditation and how would that then affect our general cognitive processes. So that's it. Many thanks to collaborators Amishija, Helene Slachter and Willoughby Britton, and thank you for listening.
샤마다나 마인드풀니스 자기시라 당 얘기 지와데 가르쳐야되려나 얘 지와지도 나랑 삼수셔야되라 지와 가르쳐야되려나 당 아주 곰다 대화요에다 해피니스 가르쳐야되나 셈지가 두개라 가자기 게나나마서 아주 투레 얘 지와 가르치려나 셈 가와요를 지와지 다른 얘기하는 지와 가르치려나 셈디 수제르다 수메레스 기디 디 수제 이바이나 아니 지금 부자 디 개주나라 아메리카나라 아니 인터넷에 보고 추지지 레바메주지 게네 아니 뉴로사이언스 기타제도 콜 레바메도스 아니 콜 제도 대투 말을 라이제스 암코 제로 듀데와 마세 아니 티비타디 게무쇼 이제야요레스 디 마세 가조 남비스다 가조게 야랍로 듀타와나 자와군제 주베가라 미케 제조들지 마신 대게들 루지지요레스 안 하바도 예 가자 디콜라 게 에릭라 게지티 게 에릭게 아니 아이 don't know 네 야수 이나야 게 에릭게 갈 갈라스나 아니 가자 이자 니도 주시로라 아니 야나나로라 아니 레체 메교기 아니 미충을 소아 모노티고를 직 송송 아디나 캐나 델타지 카리어스 대와 직체라 니베자라 기시 캐나기 아니 셰바디 수메 두기나 셰바디 수메 두기 땅 아주 가리깡에들 단다 다와 직슬라 지리바냐 뭐 계시레 지리방문에 저기 캐나기 셰바디 계시기나 익스피리언스 가리기토는 프루프 지기를 난 라기도 딩 아주 낭베토는 그도 프루프 지깔 하고 싶어도스 아케나 기시 셰바 수메 두기나 아케나 기 셰바 수메디 딘데지레라는 가지고 프루프 지도나 아주 주마 지리바다 가리토나 계시 셰바이나 레라고 있어요.
Since from the yesterday we are talking about mindfulness, shamatha meditation, so I would like to ask one question related with consciousness. And sometime back, I think yesterday during conversation, I asked where is the consciousness, and today my answer is that what is the consciousness? Is it a physical phenomena or a non-physical phenomena? If it is a physical phenomena, then where do you find it? Is it in the brain? If it is the brain, if it is in the brain, then there are some cases where people don't have brains, and specifically, I hear that in 1980s there was a boy in the United States who was born without a proper brain, and also in Tibetan history during the 7th Dalai Lama, it was mentioned that there was a man who was beheaded, but he was still alive, and so how you describe this kind of stories, and if consciousness is a non-physical phenomena as we think about, and when we say consciousness is a non-physical phenomena, then people ask us to describe about it, and we fail to show what consciousness looks like since it is a non-physical phenomena. So as a scientist, if you think that there's a possibility of consciousness being a non-physical phenomena, from your way of understanding, how you will going to describe it and how you will going to try to prove that this is the consciousness?
Wow, that's a tough question. Especially since I'm not a consciousness researcher, so actually usually in my work I sort of conveniently stay away from the question about consciousness. Having said that, that's of course not a very satisfying answer, so I will try to say something about it. a lot of the models of cognition that I'm talking about, I'm thinking about, focus mostly on the conscious part of experience. So they don't really describe as much about what's going on unconsciously, although they typically have a description of it. So my meditation model would describe consciousness in terms of, you know, the kind of memories that can be retrieved. Those would be conscious, and there might be other memories that are less active. You cannot easily retrieve them, and those would probably be unconscious for the model. Now that just says something about the mind, and actually a lot of the cognitive models that we have are not explicitly related to the brain. However, of course, there's a lot of Western scientists that talk about consciousness in relation to the brain, and I think the consensus would be in Western science that we think that consciousness definitely depends on the brain. So it's clear that if you zap people's brain, there is a difference in people's consciousness. If you cut out a part of someone's brain and they still survive, there's a change in their consciousness. If you entirely remove their brain, I haven't heard of those stories, so I can't say anything sensible about that. But in general, without a brain, it's quite hard to be conscious. And in fact, if you look at someone's brain and it doesn't show any activity at all, there's a 99.9% chance they're not conscious, although there might be near-death experiences that we don't have very much scientific evidence about. So again, we can't say very much about it in terms of science. But it is clear that the way you experience the world does depend to some extent on your brain. So yeah, for example, one pretty plausible theory of consciousness defines it in terms of, you know, what part of the brain work together. Is your brain functioning in terms of just a very local island that can only is basically occupied with perceiving whatever is there in the world, and it doesn't translate much further up in the higher levels of your brain that have to do with sense making, then that would be a sign of someone who is not very conscious. So when you're asleep, for example, your perceptual impressions won't make it all the way to far up in your brain. When you are awake, then there's a much further propagation of brain activity. So those are some of the theories that I think make more sense, and the cutting edge of consciousness research is really focusing on these different types of brain states. So you look at people, for example, in a vegetative state that have had an accident and cannot respond anymore. So what's different about their brains? And well, we are far from knowing what's really going on.
It's not my area of expertise, but we are approaching an era where we can begin to test systematically some of these hypotheses. There are studies where we can have reversible lesions in the brain where certain parts of the brain are hyperstimulated so that it is more active, and there are other parts of the brain that are temporarily knocked out. So perhaps we can, in the laboratory, achieve the state of someone without a head.
Ani gomde ani logle na mapap ne ani pejutanya te ani tandabad ani penu chichu karachung susra mambala chirangi ta chisol penne khases yungsare kichrangi dinsu karse seora odi.
Since you yourself is a very good meditation practitioner, so based on your own experience, so what kind of the benefits we can gain from the kind of work that you are doing, the computational modeling of the cognitive experiences, and what kind of benefits we can expect from this kind of research in the future, and how confident you are about the kind of benefits that we may get in the future?
That's another great question. I'm not sure whether I'm such a good meditation practitioner, but let's not talk about that. I think that the work that's been done so far in terms of the cognitive correlates or the effects of meditation on cognition is really preliminary. We focused on a lot of attention tasks because, you know, in meditation instructions, that's what it emphasizes. So it's a good starting point in terms of developing theories of what might be going on. However, I don't think this is actually really the core of what's going on. So in the second study, where I focused on people's tendency to get stuck in certain types of mental patterns, I think, judging from my own experience, that's a much more important effect of meditation. And I'm very much thinking very hard these days about how I can develop new measures that can really get at that. Because for me, in terms of my own experience, you can really see how people change when they start practicing meditation. You can sometimes see how they become more flexible, more fluid, have a bit more humor about themselves. But in terms of our cognitive theories of the mind, it's very hard to find the concepts and measures that people find believable, that are reproducible, and that still catch some of that quality. So that's one reason why I'm now working on a computer model of meditation to help me, or help us really as a community, build a better theory, a sort of a Western counterpart maybe of Buddhist psychology, of what's really going on here. So there's, again, we're still just only starting to investigate this.
Well, I have a question for you, Marieke. In the beginning of your talk, you mentioned a distinction between a shamatha type of meditation, the changes being that an individual was better at detecting very small changes in a stimulus, sort of an increase in perceptual acuity. And then you spoke of open monitoring kinds of meditation producing a different kind of benefit, which is a better capacity to notice a wider range of perceptual information that perhaps is presented very rapidly out of the scope of focus. And this brought me to a question that also is related to one of the collaborators that you thanked, Willoughby Britton, who is someone whose work when I think of her, I think of some of the work she's done that suggests that there are some pitfalls, some harm that can happen with certain kinds of meditation. And so I wonder if your computational modeling will be able to tell us a little bit more about the sort of synergistic benefit, a little bit like what you were just saying of a flexible, adaptive, and multifaceted meditation approach instead of a sort of singular, I'm only going to do shamatha, or I'm only going to do compassion, or I'm only going to do open monitoring. Has there been some evidence that just one kind of meditation can actually be deleterious or harmful?
I also really appreciate Willoughby Britton's work on potential pitfalls of meditation. I think it's really important question because we in the West tend to have developed this idea that, you know, meditation and mindfulness, they're going to solve all our problems, and that in itself is of course a huge trap. In terms of my computational model, I'm not sure how much it can say about that. What I've understood from Willoughby's work so far is that what tends to be a tremendous pitfall in Western practitioners, probably in particular, is the tendency to, indeed, as you suggest, focus so much on one type of meditation, and in particular on progressing through different levels, that becomes the aim in itself, rather than, you know, working with the mind and becoming maybe, how do you say that? Even becoming a better human is already a sort of goal where you can get stuck into. But it's this tendency, as far as I understood, this striving tendency that we probably are particularly prone to in the West, that also might be underlying some of the depression problems that we talked about this morning, and the anxiety, like I'm not good enough. I think that's probably all talking about the same tendency, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about that work so that we can better understand what the potential pitfalls are, and therefore also maybe better advise people or see when they go off in this kind of a path and it becomes a hindrance rather than a help. Because of course meditation is not just about concentration, and if you're trying to just cultivate concentration and there is no aspect of altruism or compassion, and it's just about becoming a superhuman or something like that, that's where a lot of problems will probably start.
Koran nangbaji ledo dindesan zani mindfulness le di jidang teman yershalan du sheido kundu nujobe ta judi da ani nujobala na kundu western science ro zu ta judi da ani koran nangbaji leshan ta judi da ari ke bade chikche ro chik di ni khaji girig la ni dus ke judi zambala ani subu chashin ani keje shudi kharzi ge le di ko lebad zigre lasra di koran de ge de mes kizi ni lebme na ani danji geshela ge ro this geosa do this lebme na ani mitso tur so do maresle.
Two questions. First one is that since you are a Buddhist and you have the knowledge about the concept of mindfulness meditation according to the Buddhist traditions, and also since you are Western scientists, you have this understanding of this mindfulness practice that is going on in the Western scientific community. So what are the differences in terms of understanding of the term, the mindfulness, and the meditation part of it, between the two of these traditions? And the second part of the question is that it's related with the brain, and so in our whole system of our body, which organ is the most important? I asked this question to again Eric at the neuroscience teacher that we have during our workshop, and he told me that he believed that brain is the most important organ in our whole body system. So do you also believe that brain is the most important part? And so if not, then can we live without a brain?
Okay, maybe I should start with the second question. I think it's probably a bit more straightforward. So, which organ is the most important? I don't think you can live without the brain. Actually, you probably also cannot, I'm pretty sure you cannot really live without the heart. Well, maybe these days there are some heart-like machines that could take over some of that function, but you know, you need both of these devices to function as an organism. So I think that's pretty clear. As regards the difference between sort of mindfulness practice in the West and meditation maybe as a spiritual path for enlightenment, which is how I interpret your question, I think one of the important distinctions already came up this morning in terms of, you know, mindfulness is typically pursued with a motivation to feel better. It's for people who have mental suffering and they just practice it to feel better. Whereas meditation as a spiritual path, you can actually not practice when you're not mentally stable and well. So, and actually then once you are in a stable and healthy place, only then you can start to pursue it as a spiritual path to, well, gain enlightenment, to look for a deeper reality of things and a deeper meaning of what it means to be human and what it means to live a good life. Now, it doesn't mean that those two are cleanly separated, because it often occurs, I've heard from some Western mindfulness teachers who have also pursued a serious Buddhist path. For example, Stephen Batchelor and Michael Cheskolson have been, I think to some extent, been Buddhist monks as well. And they said, you know, sometimes actually they get people who first do a mindfulness course to feel better, and then switch into really more taking it up as a religion to really change their perception of reality and go into these deeper concepts. So I think a primary difference is really in terms of the why people do that, and then how that changes their outlook on what it means to be a human being. And actually, one important, while I have the microphone, one important concept that I think might be helpful here is that, you know, is your primary focus, is it being a successful being? Is that the meaning of being a human being? That's what we're taught often in the West, either explicitly or implicitly. Or is it something deeper? Is it, you know, about connecting with a deeper reality where it's not so much about me, but it's about a larger whole, which is, as far as I understand, is where it becomes more of a spiritual path. So actually your complete value system changes, and that's, I think, when it starts to become more of a Buddhist path or some other spiritual path for that matter. And that might be the difference that we're talking about here.